If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. The Mysterious Intruder. I decided to dog-sit for Alex on New Year's Eve because, honestly, I didn't have much else going on. Alex was headed out of town for a party, and he asked if I could watch his dog, Bailey, for the night. It seemed easy enough. Watch some TV, order food, and keep Bailey company while fireworks went off. Alex left around 6 p.m., handed me the keys, and reminded me to lock the door. The house was in a quiet suburb, nothing unusual. I'd been there a handful of times before, so I felt comfortable. But things started getting weird around 9 p.m. when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened the door, there was a woman standing there. She looked to be in her late 20s or early 30s, dressed in a casual sweater and jeans. She smiled, almost like she knew me, and said, "Oh hey, I'm Alex's girlfriend. I just need to grab something I left in the house." This threw me off because Alex never mentioned a girlfriend, but I didn't want to be rude. She rattled off some convincing details about Alex's life, his favorite food, his job, stuff like that. I figured she was legit, so I let her in. She went upstairs for maybe 2 minutes, came back with what looked like a small shoebox, and left with a cheery "thanks. Tell Alex I'll call him later." It felt odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time. After she left, I locked the door again and went back to the couch, trying to shake off the weird feeling she gave me. Something about her smile. It was just a little too rehearsed. But I told myself I was overthinking it. Bailey seemed calm, and I figured if Alex trusted her enough to give her details about his life, there was no reason for me to stress. Still, I texted Alex to let him know she had stopped by. No response. I guessed he was busy with his party, so I left it at that. Around 11 p.m., I was in the kitchen grabbing a drink when I heard the doorknob jiggle. My heart immediately shot into my throat. Bailey, who had been lounging in his bed, sprang up and started barking like crazy. I froze for a second, just staring at the door. Then I heard it again, the sound of someone trying to turn the handle. I crept to the living room window and peeked out through the blinds. There was a man standing on the porch, looking down at something in his hand. I couldn't make it out at first, but when he stepped closer to the door, I saw it, a key. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my phone and called Alex, but it went straight to voicemail. My stomach sank. Bailey's barking got louder, and the man outside must have realized someone was home because he stopped fiddling with the door and stepped back. For a moment, I thought he was leaving, but then I saw him pull out his phone and make a call. Less than a minute later, 2 more people appeared from the side of the house, a man and a woman. They were all talking to each other in low voices, and one of them pointed toward the backyard. Panic hit me hard. I locked every door and window I could think of and grabbed a kitchen knife, just in case. The dog wouldn't stop barking, and I was scared they'd break a window to get in. That's when I remembered the key, the one the woman from earlier must have taken. It all clicked. She wasn't Alex's girlfriend. She was setting this up. My hands were shaking as I called 911. The operator told me to stay calm and that officers were on their way, but that didn't stop me from feeling like they'd burst in at any second. I could hear them moving outside, trying doors, rattling windows. One of them even knocked on the back door and whispered something, like they were testing if I'd come out. The minutes waiting for the police felt like hours. I kept peeking through the blinds, trying to keep an eye on the intruders without being seen. They were circling the house now, trying every possible way in. At one point, One of them climbed onto the deck and started testing the sliding glass door. I could see his silhouette through the curtains. He was tall, wearing a hoodie, and holding what looked like a crowbar. My chest felt tight, and I was gripping the knife so hard my hand started cramping. Bailey's barking became more frantic, and I worried they might do something to him if they got inside. Then, just as I started to think they'd give up, I heard glass shatter in one of the upstairs rooms. My stomach dropped. I ran halfway up the stairs and stopped, unsure what to do. Should I try to scare them off? Hide? Before I could decide, I heard footsteps above me. Someone was inside. I whispered to the 911 operator that they'd broken in, and she assured me the police were just a few minutes away. Those minutes felt like an eternity. I stood frozen on the stairs, listening as the intruder moved around upstairs. Drawers opening, things being knocked over. It sounded like they were searching for something specific. The footsteps upstairs grew louder, more deliberate, like whoever was up there was walking with purpose now. Bailey had stopped barking and was whimpering in the corner, which somehow made everything feel even more terrifying. I kept thinking about the knife in my hand. Would I actually be able to use it if they came downstairs? I didn't know, and the thought made me feel sick. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A second set of footsteps, this time coming from the other side of the house. There wasn't just one person inside, there were at least two. I was about to retreat back to the kitchen when I saw headlights flash through the living room window. The cops had finally arrived. I heard someone outside yell, "Police," and the sound of heavy footsteps running across the yard. The intruders must have panicked because there was a loud crash upstairs, like something heavy falling, and then silence. I didn't dare move until I heard the officers banging on the door, shouting for me to open up. My legs felt like jelly as I ran to unlock it. When I let them in, the relief was so overwhelming I thought I might collapse, but the fear wasn't over yet. The police swept through the house, guns drawn, but the intruders were gone. They'd escaped through the broken window upstairs. After the police finished their search, they asked me to describe everything. I told them about the woman who claimed to be Alex's girlfriend, how she must have stolen a key, and what happened after she left. One of the officers looked concerned and said, "It sounds like they knew exactly what they were doing." That comment made my skin crawl. They didn't take much, just a few things from Alex's bedroom, but it was clear they weren't just random thieves. They had a plan, and I had walked right into it by letting that woman inside. The cops said they'd patrol the area for the night, but there wasn't much else they could do. When Alex finally came back the next morning, I told him everything. At first, he looked confused, then horrified. "I don't have a girlfriend," he said, his face pale. That's when he mentioned something that made everything worse. A few months ago, he had a falling out with an old friend, someone who knew a lot about his life and even had a spare key at one point. Alex never got the key back. We both realized this wasn't random at all. Whoever those people were, they wanted something specific, and they had no problem scaring me half to death to get it. To this day, Alex doesn't know what they were after, and I still get chills thinking about how easily they could have gotten in if I hadn't been home. The haunting hallway encounter. We had just gotten back to the penthouse after ringing in the new year with some friends. It was around 2 a.m., and the hallway was eerily quiet, with only the hum of the building's ventilation system breaking the silence. My fiancée and I were laughing about some stupid joke when we first noticed her. She was standing at the far end of the hallway, near the fire escape door. At first, I thought she was just a party guest who had gotten lost. Her clothes were wrinkled, and her hair looked like she'd been through a windstorm. But the way she stood there, swaying slightly, staring blankly at the wall, sent a shiver down my spine. It was just off. We whispered to each other, trying to decide if we should approach her or just walk to our door and mind our business. Before we could move, she turned her head, almost too quickly, and locked eyes with us. I swear I stopped breathing for a second. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sunken and wild, like she hadn't slept in days. She didn't say anything, just kept staring, unblinking. My fiancé nudged me, and we decided to walk past her, giving her as much space as possible. As we passed, I felt her gaze follow us, and then she did something that made my skin crawl. She leaned toward one of the doors and started peering through the peephole, like she was trying to see who was inside. We hurried to our door, fumbling with the keycard as the tension in the hallway seemed to thicken. I was sure she would just stay by that other door, but as I glanced over my shoulder, she was moving. Not walking, staggering toward us, her steps uneven and almost animalistic. My fiancé muttered under his breath, "What the hell is she doing?" I didn't answer because I couldn't. I was frozen, clutching the keycard like it was my last lifeline. She stopped about halfway down the hallway, tilted her head like she was listening for something, and then started laughing, a low, raspy sound that didn't match her disheveled appearance. It was like she was in on some cruel joke that only she understood. We managed to get the door open, and I practically shoved us both inside, slamming it shut behind us. My heart was pounding as I locked the deadbolt, but the feeling of safety didn't last long. Not even a minute later, we heard her footsteps, slow and deliberate, stopping right outside our door. Then came the banging, loud, relentless, and desperate. She wasn't yelling or saying anything, just pounding on the door like she was trying to break it down. My fiancé whispered that we should call security, but my hands were shaking too much to even unlock my phone. And then, as suddenly as it started, the banging stopped. It was dead silent again. For a moment, I thought she had left, but then came the sound of something dragging against the door, like nails or fingertips scraping across the surface. We stood there in silence, too scared to even breathe, listening to the scraping noise. My fiancé mouthed, "Check the peephole," but there was no way I was going near that door. Instead, we stood frozen, staring at the faint shadows of her movements under the crack at the bottom of the door. After what felt like forever, the scraping stopped. I thought she might have gone, but then we heard a new sound, this guttural, animal-like growl. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make the hair on my arms stand up. My fiancé grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, just in case the lock wasn't enough. Just when we thought it couldn't get worse, there was a loud thud. It sounded like she threw herself against the door, and I swear I felt it shake. That's when the panic set in. My fiancé whispered that we needed to get out and find help, but how? She was right there. The thudding continued, rhythmic and violent, and then it stopped again. When I finally worked up the courage to look through the peephole, I almost screamed. She wasn't standing anymore. She was crawling, slowly, like a spider, her hands and feet moving in jerky motions. Her head was tilted back so I could see her face, and her mouth was twisted into this unnerving grin. She started crawling toward our door, her movements quickening like she could sense me watching. I stumbled back from the door, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. My fiancé grabbed my arm and hissed, "We need to go. Now." I nodded, barely able to think straight, and we decided to make a break for it. There was a stairwell just a few doors down from our suite, and if we could get there, we'd at least be out of the hallway. He slowly pulled the chair away from the door, and we stood there, holding our breath, listening. Nothing. Not a sound. I reached for the doorknob, and just as I turned it, the banging started again, louder and more frantic this time, like she knew what we were planning. Without thinking, I yanked the door open, and there she was, barely a foot away, sprawled on the floor. I don't know how we did it, but we ran. She let out this horrible screech, almost like a wail, and I swear I could hear her crawling after us as we sprinted down the hallway. When we reached the stairwell, we slammed the heavy metal door behind us and bolted down the steps, not stopping until we were 2 floors below. My legs were trembling so badly I could barely stand. My fiancée tried to call security, but no one picked up. We stayed there for what felt like hours, just huddled in the stairwell, listening for any sound of movement. Finally, we decided to head back up, thinking maybe she'd be gone. But the hallway was empty when we returned. No sign of her, just silence. When we got back to the penthouse hallway, everything seemed normal, but it felt wrong, like the air was heavier somehow. There was no sign of the woman, no footprints, no marks on the walls or the door, nothing to suggest she'd ever been there. My fiancé and I exchanged a look, both of us silently asking the same question. Did that really happen? We checked the door to our suite, and to our shock, there wasn't a single scratch or dent on it. That didn't make sense. The way she had been pounding and scraping, there should have been damage. My fiancé muttered something about checking the building's security cameras, and honestly, it sounded like our only hope of proving we weren't losing our minds. We went straight to the lobby and found the night guard at his desk, scrolling on his phone. We told him everything, breathlessly describing the woman, her bizarre behavior, and the way she'd chased us. At first, he seemed skeptical, but when he saw how shaken we were, he agreed to check the cameras. We huddled around the screen as he rewound the footage of our hallway. My stomach was in knots, expecting to see her creeping down the corridor, but instead, nothing. The footage showed us returning to our suite, laughing as we walked down the hallway. Then the door shut behind us, and after that, the hallway stayed empty. No woman. No crawling. No pounding. Just nothing. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, or rather, not seeing. My fiancé leaned closer to the screen, his face pale, and asked the guard to rewind it again, slower this time. We watched the same thing, us walking to the door, entering, and then nothing. "That's impossible," I whispered. The guard just shrugged, like this kind of thing wasn't his problem. I could feel my frustration bubbling up, but more than that, there was this overwhelming sense of dread. If she wasn't on the footage, then what did we experience? I asked if there were cameras near the stairwell, thinking maybe she'd be caught on those, but he shook his head. "Those have been out of order for months," he said flatly, like he couldn't care less. We went back to the penthouse, but neither of us could sleep. Every little sound made me jump. Pipes creaking, wind rattling the windows, even the elevator dinging in the distance. My fiancé tried to reassure me, saying maybe she was just someone from a party who had too much to drink, but he didn't sound convinced. I couldn't shake the image of her crawling toward us, that twisted grin on her face. Around 5 a.m., as the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I finally drifted off, but my sleep was restless and full of nightmares. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. All I know is, something wasn't right about her. And sometimes, late at night, I think I hear faint tapping on the door, even though no one's there. The Haunted Rocking Chair. It started as a regular New Year's Eve party, nothing out of the ordinary. My friend Jake had invited a small group of us to his family's old farmhouse, which they mostly used as a vacation home these days. It was the perfect setting, cozy, a bit rustic, and far from the noise of the city. Everything was going smoothly. The music was low, people were laughing, and the smell of appetizers filled the kitchen. Around 11 p.m., Jake suggested we play some card games in the living room. That's when it all began. At first, I thought I was imagining things, faint, rhythmic creaking sounds coming from somewhere below us. It wasn't loud, just soft enough to barely catch my attention. I mentioned it to Jake, and he shrugged it off, saying it was probably the old pipes. But the sound kept coming back, a steady, almost deliberate rhythm. A couple of times, other people paused mid-conversation, looking around as if they'd noticed it too. By 11:30, the noise had become impossible to ignore. Jake and I exchanged uneasy glances. "You think it's the wind?" he asked, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. The farmhouse was old, but it was solid. The wind shouldn't be making noises like that, not the kind that sounded eerily like a rocking chair moving back and forth. "Let's check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Jake hesitated, but curiosity, or maybe peer pressure, got the better of him, and we headed down to the basement together. The basement was colder than I expected, even for a winter night. Jake flicked on the light, but only a single dim bulb illuminated the space, casting long shadows over the cluttered room. It smelled faintly of mildew, and the concrete floor felt damp underfoot. The creaking had stopped the moment we opened the door to the basement, which only made the silence more unsettling. Jake muttered something about it probably being nothing, but we both knew we wouldn't go back upstairs until we were sure. We moved carefully, stepping around old furniture, boxes, and what looked like decades of forgotten belongings. Then we saw it, the rocking chair. It was pushed into a corner near an old cabinet, a simple wooden thing with peeling white paint and faded cushions. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, with a layer of dust on the armrests. Jake was about to laugh it off when the chair suddenly moved. Not a small wobble or a shift like you might expect from uneven flooring. This thing rocked. Slowly, back and forth, as if someone were sitting in it. I felt every hair on my body stand on end. Jake froze, and I swear for a second, I thought he was about to bolt. But neither of us moved, too shocked to do anything but stare at the chair as it creaked steadily in the stillness. For a moment, I thought I might be hallucinating. My brain scrambled to find an explanation. Maybe a draft, or the floor settling. But the air down there was completely still. No windows, no vents. Jake whispered, "Did you see that?" Like I wasn't already standing there, wide-eyed and shaking. Before I could respond, the rocking chair slowed to a stop, like whatever unseen force was moving it had noticed we were watching. We stood frozen, the silence louder than any sound. My chest felt tight, and I had to remind myself to breathe. Then Jake broke the silence. "We're leaving," he muttered, grabbing my arm. But just as we turned toward the stairs, the chair started rocking again, faster this time. It was no longer gentle. It creaked violently, the old wood groaning as if protesting against some invisible weight. I felt a sharp chill race down my spine, and my legs felt like they might give out. Jake yanked me forward, practically dragging me up the steps. The moment we slammed the basement door shut, the creaking stopped entirely. We stood there in the hallway, gasping for breath, neither of us daring to speak. Back in the living room, the party was still going on like nothing had happened. The laughter and music felt surreal after what we'd just witnessed. Jake and I sat down, but neither of us touched our drinks or joined the conversation. I kept glancing toward the basement door, half expecting it to burst open on its own. After a while, Jake leaned in and whispered, "That chair. It belonged to my grandma." His voice was so low I almost didn't hear him over the noise. She used to sit in it every day before she passed. My parents brought it here after we sold her house. I don't know why it's still down there. That made my stomach churn. It felt like a piece of the puzzle I didn't want to put together. Jake admitted he hadn't been in the basement in months, and now I understood why. The thought of his grandmother's chair rocking on its own, like it had been waiting for us to notice it, was more than I could handle. We stayed upstairs for the rest of the night, but every creak or thump in the old farmhouse made me jump. By the time the clock struck midnight, I was ready to leave, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. Jake didn't bring it up again, but I could see it in his face. He was just as shaken as I was. Around 1 a.m., the party started winding down. A few people had already left, and the rest were either passed out on couches or gathering their things to head home. Jake offered me a guest room for the night, but there was no way I was staying in that house. I came up with an excuse about needing to get back early in the morning and started putting on my coat. As I walked toward the front door, I glanced down the hallway one last time. The basement door was slightly open. I swear, I closed that door earlier. I know I did. Jake must have seen me staring because he quickly walked over and pushed it shut, his movements stiff and hurried. Probably the draft, he muttered, but we both knew there was no draft. I didn't say anything. I just wanted to leave. I stepped outside into the cold night, the snow crunching under my boots, and made my way to my car. As I reached for the door handle, I stopped. In the faint glow from the porch light, I could see the curtains in the living room shift, like someone was standing there, watching. But when I turned to look, the window was empty. The drive home felt endless. My mind kept replaying the image of that rocking chair moving on its own, the sound of it creaking in the silence, and that last glance at the basement door ajar. I tried rationalizing it. Maybe the floor really was uneven, or maybe Jake's house was just old and creepy. But deep down, I knew none of that made sense. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was too wired to sleep. Instead, I sat in my car for a while, staring out at the empty street, as if something or someone might have followed me home. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Jake. "Did you feel anything weird last night? Like, after you left?" My stomach sank. I replied asking what he meant, and it took him a while to respond. When he finally did, his message made my blood run cold. I heard the creaking again. But this time, it was upstairs. I stared at my phone, half expecting him to follow up with, "Just kidding," or something to take the edge off. But nothing else came. I haven't talked to Jake since that night. Whatever happened in that basement, I don't want to know any more about it. And I definitely don't want to go back.